Hi everyone, Professor Rios here. Hope you're doing well. And welcome to chapter 4 of the semester. This deals with population geography. In addition to population geography, obviously the main theme of the week, there is a population analysis homework, which sort of follows from last week's population data gathering homework, which was simply collecting data for the country that you were assigned. So the instructions for the homework are pretty comprehensive, so make sure you go over every bit of it. It's comprehensive on purpose, so don't just sort of assume that it's pretty straightforward. I mean, it is, but you know, follow the instructions and you'll be fine. So let's see. Besides that, don't forget the weekly to-do list. So make sure that you read that so you know what is due by when. In addition, make sure that uh, if you have any questions, that you come to the live office hour. Again, that's posted on the class page. And having said all that, well, let's get going. So this image here, of course, Grand Central Station in Midtown Manhattan. I picked it just as a function of how it represents streams of people moving through. And while this is mostly tied to transportation, I understand that. It sort of hints at the idea of population. And we're going to talk about world patterns and regional trends. So this image right here, it's a bit dated, 2011, but just to give you a sense of how population is generally distributed across the US, this really hasn't changed that much since 2011. The numbers obviously have, but the pattern is primarily the same. If you look at a place like the Northeast corridor from about Boston through Providence, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore, it's a very densely populated area. If you look at a place like, whether it be Chicago, the San Francisco, LA areas, even in Texas, you see Houston, Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio. So you see the big three cities represented there as well. So it gives you a sense. Population tells you a lot about a place, whether it be straight up numbers or whether it is patterns or shape of population pyramid. So there's a lot to glean out of population data. So let's get going. So the big idea, so as of 2022, there are 7.8 billion people on Earth. It was 6 billion in the year 2000. It was 5 billion in the year 1987. So we will probably reach around 8 billion sometime around the year 2025 or 2024, depending on who you listen to. This is how it changes roughly per day and per year, and there are big disparities between the developed world and the less developed world. And that's frankly one of the big argument points about population, has been for decades, will continue to be as we move through the 2020s. So it really talks about, what are the differences in land use, urban versus industrial, rural versus non-rural, or the idea of city versus the countryside, if you want to simplify it even more. What about the availability of resources, impact of disasters, and frankly, you should add climate change to this as well, because there is a tie in there somewhere to climate change as a function of usage by the people in the particular area. So population geography, it differs from the idea of demography because population geography is more of an analysis tool. Like how do people, the age of people, the distribution of males versus females, fertility patterns, density. How does that help you understand what is going on in a particular area? Some countries are shrinking, some countries are growing pretty fast still, and many countries have essentially sort of stabilized. And that's the general trend going on a worldwide scale. There's sort of the idea of stability in population. Okay. If you listen to these are not some individuals like Elon Musk has stated that the world is in trouble because we don't have enough people. He feels that we're not really growing quickly enough in order for the world to continue to sort of advance. He's not a population expert, that's just his opinion. But of course, being, well, Elon Musk, he's going to get attention. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but he probably has some grounding in a bit of data in that if a population either slows down too quickly or begins to shrink, then that population becomes older, meaning there's not enough young people. And young people in their working age, and I'm talking about ages 18 to about 50, are the ones that are primarily contributing to the domestic product of that particular country. That's just the way that is. So if you have too few young people, that makes a difference in the economic vigor of a country. And guess what? We're headed in that direction in the United States. We're getting progressively older in this country because your generation and the generation that preceded you and the generation that will follow you, if you're around 20 years of age, isn't frankly having that many kids. So it's kind of a big deal. By the way, there is a TED Talk link that I hope you watch as well that is posted on the class page for the week. So make sure you get to that because it really explains population pyramids, I think, pretty well. Again, why is population geography important? And there you have it in the yellow. I won't read it to you. You can stop the video and sort of look at it in a bit more detail, maybe think about it some. But population geography is important. I wouldn't cover it and harp on it as much as I do if it wasn't. I think it's probably one of the most significant aspects of human geography that ties to a whole bunch of other facts and aspects of daily life. It affects things like geopolitics. It affects, obviously, the economy, the economic vigor, health. Climate change affects people, which in turn affects other aspects of life. So population geography, significant. And these are some of the implications. Local, regional, and global stability. We are a connected world. It's impossible to avoid. COVID-19 showed that to a great extent, but really the economics of the world are all tied together. So what happens in the United States affects other countries. What happens in China affects us, Europe, Russia, Africa, parts of Asia. Think about where your stuff comes from your clothing, your computers, your phone, lumber, equipment that is used to build homes and that kind of stuff. It all comes from somewhere else. It isn't really local that much anymore. There is some locality to the economics of daily life, but more and more, think about, and I'm sort of diverging into economics a bit, but just for the purpose of argument, think about the food you eat in winter. Where do you think those blueberries come from in New York in January or February? It's not New York State, I can guarantee you that. So therefore, that's the connections, the globalization that's sort of inherent in daily life. Here's population growth, looking at 2017, the forecast for 2050, around 9.8 billion. This is what's happened to developed countries in the world. Notice the very, very significant leveling off, and the less developed regions of the world continue to increase and eventually level off themselves. Again, a bit dated, using data from 2017, but still the pattern really hasn't changed. The rankings haven't changed. China, India, and the US are at 1, 2, 3. The United States, I would say, as of 2022, we're probably around 330 million. China and India will probably swap places by 2050, where India would be the most populated country, and China actually decreases in size a bit. Although they're doing things to curb that. So this number may be subject to other socioeconomic and social policies that China may put in place. Notice the United States falls to number 4 as Nigeria continues to grow by the mid-century. If you're interested, there's a lot of US Census data that are just coming out from 2020. And that census data are available there in that census.gov link. So something for you to look at. A local example would be the town of Kiryas Joel in Orange County. This is probably one of the most interesting places. Highland Mills is what I call home, so I'm not that far from it. And it's the idea of what is happening there. It's probably one of the youngest, most rapidly growing populations in the entire United States. Okay. And so this is sort of one of the reasons why Orange County actually continues to grow. So it's a very interesting place. If you've maybe you've driven by it, if you've gone to the Woodbury Common, you've probably had some kind of interaction there. It's an interesting population that gets into the idea of culture and ethnicity and religion, but it really ties into population as well. So let's look at some of the definitions and some of the lingo and language of population. Crude birth rate, probably the most simple one. So it's the idea of number of births per 1,000 people. It is considered crude because it relates to the total population without regards to the age or sex composition of the population. So that's crude birth rate. You collected this graph for the homework of last week. And this is birth rates across the world. Notice the darker green and where you tend to find them. Notice where you tend to find the idea of projection population change. And so who is growing the fastest? Africa, Asia, and then India, North America, and so on and so on. In China, there's some basic national policy and family planning that has been sort of started, stopped, started again, stopped again. So this has been rapidly changing there. And as a result, China has an unfortunate population shape that is rather unstable. And we'll get to look at that coming up a few slides down the road. So total fertility rate, this is something that you should look at when you look at your data for your homework. It is the average number of children born to a woman during her reproductive years. And so notice the difference in these different areas, whether it be developed countries like the United States, developing countries, sub-Saharan Africa from the early 60s to the later half of the 20 teens. And everyone is dropping. That's the basic trend that you need to get out of this. Everyone is dropping. Even sub-Saharan African countries are beginning to slow down in their population growth. Bottom line is, the more developed a country is, this is a pretty easy and telling statistic. The more developed a country is, the lower its fertility rate will be. And if you're wondering why, one of the reasons is women are a more significant member and part of the workforce. So there you go. Here's total fertility rate. Notice where the numbers are really, really low. So the dark purple, between 1 and 1.5. So Europe, Japan. The United States is quickly dropping. Anything in the white is sort of steady, and anything in the green is still growing. So that's how you need to look at this graphic right here. Death rate, also called the mortality rate. Again, the number of deaths per 1,000. A high death rate does not necessarily mean you have health issues or you're in bad shape necessarily. It just simply means your population is older, so they're going to be dying off in larger numbers. So the United States has a high death rate, or starting to go in that direction. Europe. Okay. Again, characteristically found in lesser developed countries, but that is really no longer the case. Places like Denmark and Sweden and Germany and the United States and Canada and Japan are going to be having higher and higher death rates as their populations continue to age. So notice where you tend to find high death rates. Europe, Russia. Now in Russia, you have other issues to deal with, like really high rates of alcoholism, high rates of HIV/AIDS, unfortunately. You tend to find that, of course, in parts of Africa as well. So death rate is a little bit more clouded because human actions and events help shape it. Birth rate is birth rate. It's a little bit more of a clean statistic. Death rate is a bit compounded by other issues. Infant mortality rate. So it's the idea of infant deaths per 1,000 that are alive when born. Notice how that has changed from the 30s to the 2010s. So this is a pretty dated statistic, but the pattern remains the same. While the numbers might be slightly different, that yellow graph won't change. The blue graph is probably a little bit lower in every single one of these. And maternal mortality rate is probably the single greatest health marker to show you the difference between developed and developing countries. So this is how many moms sort of don't make it during the birth process. In the United States, even in the middle of the most rural of places, there are still good enough hospitals to be able to deal with complications during pregnancy. Okay? Things like a breached birth or the need for a cesarean section. That's not the case in other parts of the world. So look at the difference between developed countries and other places. Huge disparity. Okay? Usually in the United States, if you have to be born by C-section, and some of you may have, the doctor knows that well ahead of time. It's not a surprise, usually. Or if the baby is not in the right position to come out head first, right? We're not like antelope or horses that come out basically feet first or legs first. Humans don't. Humans come out head first. The doctor knows that well ahead of time, and they can plan for a C-section if necessary. Population pyramids. It's a graphic device that represents population age and sex composition. So there you can see that a cohort is basically one of those bars. It's a 5-year grouping of males or females of a particular age. And then you have a population that's in decline, like Japan, a population that's stable, like New Zealand, and a population that's disrupted, like Russia or China. So population pyramids really help you to look at the past at the present, of course, and at the future of that particular population. And you can make some pretty well educated inferences about what's going on and what will go on at a place. So this is an old pyramid, but this just to show you what Afghanistan looked like in 2000. So notice it's basically a very, very bottom heavy, meaning young person heavy population. Few old people, lots and lots of young people. And this is where you tend to find young populations. Notice Afghanistan right there. Look at Africa. In Africa, greater than 50% of the population in some places is younger than 15. That's huge. That's not the case in the US. That's not the case in Canada. I mean, how many of you who are listening to this, who are ages 18 to 25, how many of you want to have 5 or 6 kids? I'm going to go ahead and guess that number is close to 0. That wasn't the case 40 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago. So it changes. At some point, it may change because there may come a time, even in the United States, when we're going to need to have more people. And it maybe not you, it may be your kids or your grandkids who decide to have more kids. That's an interesting thing to think about, because at some point you can't just go generation after generation with people only having either no kids or 1 kid, because the population basically will sort of fall in on itself. So it will change at some point, but for now, the young populations are found where you see the darker color. This is, I love this because it's 3 neighbors with 3 different stories, whether it's Mexico, Canada, or the United States in 2022. Notice how the population of Mexico will eventually look like the population of the US looks now. So this will eventually look like this in maybe a generation. This will eventually look like this. So Canada is probably a population that's close to a stage 5. US is stage 4. Mexico is stage 3, but headed towards stage 4. Notice how quickly they're shrinking towards the younger population. So young Mexicans are not being born in the same numbers that they were even 10 years ago. Here's an example of Kuwait. More young men and more men ages 20 to 45 than women. And the difference here is imported men, basically. Men who've been imported, meaning they migrated there as a function of work possibilities. They do the jobs that the locals don't want to do: construction, sanitation, transportation. That's sort of going away to some extent because they realize that they need more people to be born. But this is a problem in places like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates. Here's China. China is a hot mess when it comes to population. Not only do they have a lot of people, but they have disrupted. So they had this huge increase, followed by a sharp decrease, followed by a huge increase, followed by a huge, entirely too long of a decrease. And they have stopped. So they're going to have another increase soon. So the problem is they're multi-disrupted and they're already really, really, really big. Look at the axis here. It's in tens of millions, whereas this is in hundreds of thousands. Huge difference. And the problem with China is, in India, come the year 2050, China and India are going to have retired aged populations that are going to be bigger than the entire United States. Think about that one for a minute. So there's going to be a population in China that is going to be retired, meaning 65 or older, roughly of around 450 million. And so will India. That's a problem. So a lot of the issues going on between China and Russia and the United States and all the tension, and it's not just COVID related, but it's just generic tension now is as a function of dealing what's going to happen then. And by then, I mean the year 2050 or so. It's going to be an interesting mid part of the century as countries begin to figure out how and what to do. Population growth, so the rate of natural increase, and the idea of a doubling time. Doubling times are becoming longer and longer. There are very few places that are doubling in population. One of them is probably sub-Saharan African countries. That's about it. And here's where places are doubling. So basically Africa, notice that same pattern emerges. In some places, there's actually shrinking going on. So Japan, Korea, South Korea, Germany, Spain, Eastern Europe. Eventually, Canada will be in that bunch. But who's growing the quickest? Then again, Africa. Now, this brings us to the demographic transition. It's a Western experience, meaning this was initially developed in order to show how places like England and France and Germany went through their population shift. Okay? And it's split into 5 stages. So let's begin with what it is. It's an attempt to summarize what you see, the relationship between population change and economic development. Let's begin with the first stage. And as of 2020, in fact, I should change this. As of 2022, there are no countries in stage 1. So when you do your analysis for the homework, do not use stage 1 for any country because none exist in that stage. This would have been more applicable to a time when there was war and famine and disasters across the earth. So this stage is not really applicable anywhere. So there's stage 1. Let's look at stage 2. Industrialization, rapid growth. You have falling death rates as people get better at sanitation and food storage and urbanization. High births are still high because large families are still considered advantageous. So there you go. Now, why the drop? You have advances again in medicine, agriculture, distribution, storage, rising income, increasing urbanization. And you get that big drop. And notice the bigger the difference between the blue and the red, the bigger the population growth. And why is it still high? There you go. Kids are labor, income, they take care of your aged parents, cultural norms are slow to change. Remember I told you how in the future there might be a push, even in the United States, to have more kids? Guess what? That's going to be a cultural norm that's going to have to be overcome. Third stage, birth rates decline. People begin to control their family size. Contraception. The advantages of having many kids basically go away. So why the drop? There you have it. Kids cost money. There's a change in the status of women in that particular society. They begin to work more. They're no longer staying at home. Some do, and that's great, but many don't. They decide to work. Society begins to alter the view of what an ideal family size is, and population begins to level off. Why does birth rate drop? Fourth stage is characterized by low birth rate and low death rates. And that's sort of where we are right now in the United States. Even though this is about to begin to go up as we get older as a country. So there, notice, that's a stage 4 country. And the 5th stage, and there's not a lot of countries in here, but it's when the death rate is actually higher than the birth rate. And so Western Europe, Canada, Japan meet this definition. And there you see the fact that the blue line, death rate, is higher than the red line, birth rate. And when this happens, it's a bit of a panic because you have to realize, what do we have to do? You can't continue to go in that direction. So at some point, there's going to be a need for countries to be probably in this stage again, because you can't continue to just simply decline. So it's a consequence that has to be addressed years down the road. So some of the idea of demographic issues. So there are still areas of the world that fit this definition. Ecumen, permanently inhabited areas of the Earth's surface, obviously, and the non-inhabited, and there's not many of these. Maybe some of the rainforests of the Amazon fit that. Congo, there are very few areas that actually fit this. Maybe Antarctica, except for some research facilities in that area. Look at the idea of density. So arithmetic density, we'll look at the idea of basically if you have an area, so you have an area that is 100,000 square kilometers, and you have 1,000,000 people. You can divide one into the other and figure out your arithmetic density. That's it. So large sections of the Sahara, Canada, Russia, and Australia have some really, really small numbers because they have huge pieces of real estate and not that many people living in them. And here's the idea of population density. Notice wherever you see the darker red, you have higher numbers. So for example, China, India, even Europe. Because Europe, even though their population is no longer growing, they have a lot of people in a relatively small area. And then wherever you either have uninhabited areas or less than 2 people per square mile. This is where population is centered. And again, it's a bit dated, 2010. New graphic hasn't been made available, but most people live roughly between 20 degrees north and let's say between 10 degrees north and about 50 degrees north. So this is basically around 50%, 60%, about 75% of the world's population lives within that band of latitude. That's where you find Mexico, Europe, India, China, the United States. As you head further south or further north, population drops off significantly. There's the idea of physiological density and agricultural density. So physiological density is the ratio between the total population and the amount of land under cultivation, meaning so that it can actually support a population of humans. And agricultural density is the ratio between the number of agriculturalists, farmers, per unit of area that can be actually farmed and used for that purpose. So here's the idea of the 3: crude density or arithmetic, physiologic, and agricultural. And you can see the difference in the numbers. So in the United States, the numbers are pretty low. So 92, 555, 105. So the closer the numbers are, the better. But look at places like Australia. 8 to 138. Why? Because large areas of Australia are not really farmable. Okay. Look at China and look at their population. They have a very interesting population pattern. The eastern half is very populated. The western half of China is almost, I want to say uninhabited, but very, very sparsely populated. So when you think of China and you think of China as a very populated place, you're really thinking about Hainan Island and Hong Kong and Shanghai and Beijing and all these other cities in the eastern, more wet area to the east. When you think of Western China and the Western Chinese provinces, Tibet, It's pretty largely uninhabited. The climate isn't conducive to agriculture. Water access isn't really available. So, as a result, population numbers are really, really low. So, here's the idea of population. 1 acre of land in China has to support 5 persons, whereas in the United States, it's about half a person per acre. So therefore, it's a lot more efficient in the United States versus India or China. Again, why population matters. The number of people in an area that can be sustained with the prevailing technology is called the carrying capacity. And if you haven't met your carrying capacity, that means you're in good shape. If you exceed your carrying capacity, that's when issues of hunger and lack of resources becomes a problem. So, for example, while this may be a slightly dated graphic here, it shows you where carrying capacity was exceeded in the 80s, exceeded between 1985 and 2000, and then likely to be exceeded between 2000 and the next 4 years or 3 years in the yellow, and then between 2025 and 2050, and after 2050. So it's probably part of the reason why this area, while still growing, has begun to identify the issue of having to slow down in its growth. And it's what makes this area of the world very different in terms of population than any other area of the world. Because it's very, very different in its pattern, in its age and sex composition. It's a reason why places like China have identified it as a future potential manufacturing hub, and why China has invested so much capital into Africa, in addition to European countries and the United States. So that's more to come on that. So, having said that, next lesson will be chapter 5, language and religion. And if you have any questions, please come to the live office hour available on Zoom. You can find the link on the class page. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.